Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can help me make it better in one of two ways. Number one is you can go to iTunes and simply write a brief review. It would really make a big difference. Number two is you can become a patron by making a donation on interviewthefuture.com. So, for those of you who may have seen my interview with Jenny Kleeman, who wrote a very interesting book called Sex, Robots, and Vegan Meat, you know that I had two most favorite quotes from that book. And one of those favorite quotes comes towards the end, and it's the following quote. Coming up with technical fixes rather than ethical reform, revolution, rebellion, every time that technology tries to stand in for ethics, we do ourselves a disservice. We deny ourselves the opportunity for growth. End of quote. That's on page 298. And during my conversation with Jenny, I told her that I must bring that person to my show. Well, today we have that person, and it is Professor Matthew Cole. Matthew is a professor of sociology and author of a book called Our Children and Other Animals, and he is also the former chair of the Vegan Society. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Matthew.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I do have to quickly say that I'm a doctor, not a professor. I know things are slightly different in North America, but you've just given me a big promotion there, which is wonderful. But in the UK, I'm not yet a professor.
Okay, are you a PhD in sociology?
Yes, yeah. So
yes, yeah.
Doctor is my title.
Right. Okay. So in North America here, we say professor, doctor.
Yeah.
I know it's more about having a tenured academic position is what you're trying to say here, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's people, when I interact with people in North America, they often, address me as professor, like they write me an email, dear Professor Cole or something. And it makes me smile. It's not a problem to me. I don't mind, but because technically speaking, in the UK, I'm not a professor.
Yeah, and I'm guilty of that mistake myself, because when I was inviting you to come on my podcast, I'm pretty sure I said Professor Cole. And that's because you do teach criminology in the Open University there, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, my current job is lecturer in criminology is my formal title. Yeah, but I definitely do identify myself as a sociologist, I would say. So I'm now a sociologist working in a criminology and social policy department. But yeah, to call me a sociologist is definitely accurate. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting and an important distinction. So I do wish you good luck with finding a tenured position as soon as possible. Let me ask you then, forgetting the book that you wrote and all the short bio that I just kind of read here, if I were to meet you in a pub somewhere in the UK, and I didn't know the first thing about you, and I ask you, who is Matthew Cole? How would you introduce yourself?
Oh, wow. Well, I guess these days my academic identity has become the dominant one. I mean, it's my work, of course, but that's very much connected to my identity as a vegan. I would say the two things have become merged in my life. I was on the path towards becoming an academic, I guess, doing my PhD, which I started 20 years ago now. And at that time, I wasn't yet a vegan. And I became vegan around the end of my PhD. My PhD was about a different topic. And it was around that time when I went vegan, I was thinking I needed something else to work on as a sociologist. I needed some other interest because I didn't want to continue with my PhD research. So it was through a conversation with a friend of mine at the time who just pointed out, well, there's lots of sociology in veganism, why don't you do something with that? And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I should do that. So it was the personal decision to go vegan came first, and then making that part of my academic work came later. So those two things are certainly really important in terms of who I am, I suppose, being a vegan and being a sociologist, and then combining the two is, I suppose, what I've been doing for the last 15 years. So I guess, yeah, um, that might be a bit heavy if I just meet someone in the pub to say, yeah, I'm a vegan and a sociologist. But yeah, that's kind of me, I suppose. Yeah, that's,
I guess fish and chips is out of the question.
well, yeah, exactly. off the menu.
Yeah. Well, I know the feeling because it's out of the question for me. Even though I did, before I went vegan about 5 years ago, I did enjoy fish and chips very much, actually, I have to say. Even though it's not the best choice for my cholesterol, as someone who is predisposed to have high cholesterol as I am now, and which consequently dropped tremendously after I became vegan, especially triglycerides. But Matthew, we are here today to talk about veganism, ethics, and their implications with respect to technology in general, but also other related issues that are more common topics on my podcast, such as artificial intelligence and transhumanism, maybe towards the end of our conversation. But I want to dive into who you are and what your work is, and sort of lay out the groundwork, which would then hopefully allow us to make connections to the rest of it. The rest of the story I want us to tell here today. And so let me just begin with this side kind of interesting, perhaps, or at least to me, interesting topic. What was your original PhD dissertation on?
It was about unemployment. So a very traditional kind of sociological topic, really. And that was more of a biographical place that came from, because I was unemployed for quite a long time in my late teens and early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to academia a little bit later in life, I guess. I didn't start my first degree until I was 26. Yeah, 26 when I started. So I had a bit of another life before then, I suppose, before I discovered sociology and everything changed. So yeah, so the PhD was a lot of that was to do with reflecting back on those experiences and trying to make sense of them, and coming across previous research in sociology, which I didn't feel captured the experience of being unemployed for me. It didn't resonate with my own experience. So as part of my PhD, of course, I would read the previous literature, previous research, a lot of it based on interviews with unemployed people. And the interpretations that were made of that experience just didn't chime with me. So my PhD kind of mutated as it went along. I thought I was going to do something fairly traditional, do my own interviews and, contribute to this well-established body of knowledge, but it ended up being something more critical of previous sociology, I guess, and in some way saying, I think there's been a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation maybe of what unemployment means. And I suppose the key to my concern was that unemployment itself was kind of socially constructed by sociology itself, reified, you might say, as this kind of state of being that has some kind of autonomous existence to it, some kind of reality to it. Whereas my perspective was it has no reality. It's a fiction. It's a form of relation to a capitalist labor market that has no necessity to exist. So just for example, an alternative to the existence of unemployment could be a universal income. There could be a universal income policy. And by doing that, you could abolish unemployment as a category, as a social welfare category. So that's at least thinkable. So I thought that
You know,
sociology had kind of forgotten that, really. And yeah, that was a problem for me.
You know, in Canada, we're conducting now, just like in many other countries, we're conducting these sociological experiments on a large scale because since the first wave of COVID, the Canadian government has given a $2,000 monthly income to about 7.5, 8 million Canadians. It used to be called the CRB. That was for about 6 months, and then it became the CERB, which will continue until next summer, I think, for all of those who can kind of show that their income has basically disappeared, or they're making a lot less than $1,000 a month due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So and you know, 7-8 million Canadian workers or people are using that program. That means, I don't know, 15-20% almost, maybe not quite 20, but like 16, 17, 18% of the Canadian workforce are using that. So that's a large scale sociological experiment with universal basic income at a pretty reasonable level. You know, $2,000 a month is not insignificant.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention. So in these extraordinary times, we see, you know, in some ways, states edging towards that kind of idea because there's no alternative. Many people simply cannot work or can't work safely, of course. Um, so, so yeah, so I thought, and I suppose that made me feel like a little bit alienated, I would say, from the discipline in some ways. Having this experience of not finding my own experience represented in the discipline that I kind of, you know, I did feel very strongly attached to when I first started learning about sociology as an undergraduate. And even before then, I thought this is fantastic. This answers a lot of the questions I've always had since a very young
Sociology
age.
does?
Yeah, absolutely. But then I reached that point where I thought, oh, actually, it doesn't have all the answers, and there are things missing here, or things that it doesn't quite get right. So yeah, so that gave me a motivation, I suppose, through my PhD. But I mean, to get to the end of the story, I suppose, it was the fact that it was so autobiographical for me. That's the reason I didn't want to continue with it, because finishing that piece of research for me was like closing a chapter. Because the experience of being unemployed wasn't great, but it wasn't all bad either. There were definite advantages to it. But I didn't want to just keep reliving that. I didn't want a whole career talking about unemployment and endlessly reflecting back on a fairly short part of my life, really. So I wanted to do something else, and veganism just made sense.
I can totally sympathize with that because, you know, my master's degree was basically focusing on armed conflict. And, you know, to be honest, you can only read so many books about people killing other people on large scale and only watch so many documentaries, you know, from Auschwitz and, you know, usage of weapons of mass destruction and stuff like that before it starts getting to you and start getting depressed, you know, or at least I did. I mean, some people have higher sort of resistance to this getting to them. They kind of are better at compartmentalizing. You know, I thought I could do that, but you know, after doing the academic work for about 3 years or so, it really started getting me down. And so I was looking for a new field, new place, new realm where I can sort of apply my interest in political science, in ethics especially. And so I moved into kind of like the interplay between technology and ethics in general, but specifically things such as artificial intelligence and then transhumanism and so on. And so here we are, both of us today. But where does rock music come into that sort of period of your life? Because Jenny Kleeman was a sort of like a, I don't want to say failed rock band member, but kind of she's a very good author now and writer and journalist and all of that. So, and she's clearly given up on the rock scene, at least for now. Where, and I know you had a stint there in rock music, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I wanted to. Yeah, I will claim the identity of a failed musician, I would say. Failed professionally, anyway. And that was certainly my first ambition before I got into sociology or anything like that. So, yeah, I was a guitarist in a thrash metal band, just a local band.
Wow.
We played a few local gigs, but didn't get further than that. But it was, it was a good band. I enjoyed it, and that was my main passion, I guess, through my teenage years
Was that a
into my
bass
early
guitar or
20s.
solo or what was it?
Well, I started off on the bass actually for about 3 years, and then I kind of um, I felt like I needed a new challenge, I suppose, like because I started playing the bass as if it was a lead guitar almost. I was, starting to play lots of solos, I guess.
Hmm.
So I moved on to guitar and played lead guitar. And yeah, that was kind of all consuming for many years. I practiced hours a day, and that was what I wanted to do. So it was only when that didn't work, eventually I thought I have to do something else. And it was another friend actually. I owe a lot to friends in my life, I have to say. It was another friend said to me at the time, "Why don't you try doing sociology and psychology as well?" I studied at the time, neither of which I did before. We didn't do that at my school, so I didn't know anything about either of them. Um, and as soon as I started, I thought, yeah, this is fascinating. This is, and I was off on a different journey. So, I mean, I've never stopped playing the guitar. I still have several guitars, and I still enjoy it. But yeah, didn't manage to make a career out of it,
Tell me something
sadly for
about
me.
the sociology of being a part of a thrash metal band, rock band, and being a vegetarian who eventually became vegan. Like, because here's the thing, uh, from my sort of ignorant, from the point of view sociological view, uh, hard rock and especially heavy metal and especially thrash metal bands have this kind of a bad boy reputation. They drink more, they play louder music, more angrier music. My wife, as my wife says, sometimes I hate listening when you're listening to your violent music, because sometimes she gets in the car and my music starts playing up suddenly when she starts the car, right? And I'm like, it's not violent music, it's actually very good music. But anyway, and so you have that reputation of them being hard partying people, drugs, even, of course, loud music, macho guys, supposedly. And then how do you fit as I think, were you vegetarian at that time already, or that came later?
Uh, not quite. I went vegetarian when I was 23, I think. So that was when I was coming to the end of that period of my life. Um, I was still playing I was playing in a different band by then, but by then it had already become more of a hobby than a serious. I'd already started to think, well, I don't think this is going to work by then. So no, I wasn't. I'd been thinking about becoming vegetarian, I guess, before then, but I hadn't got to that point. But I was definitely not a hard partying kind of a guy. I was teetotal until I was 19 or 20 or something. I didn't drink alcohol at all when I was in the main band that I was in. I think the other guys found that a bit frustrating. They could certainly drink quite effectively. I caught up later, but yeah. But like you were saying, I mean, for me, yeah, I totally get why people hear that kind of music and perceive it as violent. But I think most people who are into it will say it's not like that. It's more like it's cathartic. It gets kind of feelings of aggression out of your system. You sort of burn off that energy through playing that music or listening to it. So yeah, we were all quite peaceful, polite young men, really, in the
Wow.
band. Yeah,
That's very different from the image of a thrash metal band. And I presume me
yeah,
and you are roughly the same age, so I presume that was somewhere around the 80s, maybe?
yeah. Late 80s, early 90s. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, so okay, because basically that's the time in the 80s in Bulgaria. I was growing up in Bulgaria. So I started first with Metallica, then went harder than that, Megadeth,
Mm.
Anthrax, Sodom, Venom, like you name it, all those heavy metal groups there.
Yeah,
So AC/DC was
yeah,
like the easy stuff compared to the
yeah,
other guys, right? The
yeah.
light stuff. Uh,
Very
okay,
similar for me. Yeah,
sorry?
very similar for me. Yeah, I started with Motorhead and then
Right, Motorhead.
Metallica, and
Yeah,
then Metallica, then Slayer and Megadeth and Anthrax, etc. Yeah,
that's right.
and
Slayer was big in the 80s. Yeah.
yeah,
So okay, so then you became vegetarian and eventually vegan. So walk us through that story because I want to hear your personal story first and then see if and how it may be connecting to your academic research about the sociology of veganism.
hmm.
So
Sure.
so why you decide to become vegetarian when you did, and why did you then decide to become vegan when you did?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there were a lot of reasons why I went vegetarian originally. Like I said, I had been thinking about it, but not seriously. It had been sort of at the back of my mind for a few years, maybe since I was about, 16 or 17, something like that. But at that time, I didn't know any vegetarians or vegans personally. I I must have met some, but I hadn't knowingly met anyone who was vegetarian or vegan. So it was like another world to me at the time. So it was more of an abstract idea that seemed like the right thing to do, but I didn't sort of know how to do it, how I would go about it.
Are we talking
Um,
here late 90s, early 2000s, or what?
well, this is late 80s when I first started having these ideas, I suppose.
Wow.
Um, but yeah, it was almost. This sounds really strange now. I mean, the world has changed so much, but thinking back then, it was almost unthinkable, like to be vegetarian. I didn't know how to do it. What would that mean for my life? I mean, at the time, I was living with my dad, just the two of us, and he had me when he was quite old, older than I am now when he had me, which still blows my mind to think that. And he came from quite a rural background, and when he was growing up, hunting was a normal part of his life, fishing was a normal part of his life. So the idea of being vegetarian for him would be just completely alien. Well, it was completely alien. It just made no sense to him. So I remember now and again I would mention it, and he was just he couldn't comprehend it. It didn't make any sense. Um, so I suppose that made it easy for me to push it to the back of my own mind, just for the sake of a normal life continuing, such as it was at the time. But he died when I was 22. Yeah, 22. And obviously at that point, a lot of things changed for me. That threw a lot of things up in the air. Um, and that sort of coincided with me starting to realize that, okay, the musical career is not going to work out, or it's not likely. So lots of things changed at the same time. And I think people who go through those kind of stages in life, often there's a process of redefinition of yourself. And that's certainly something I went through at that time. And I think becoming vegetarian was part of that. It was a way of marking a break from this previous stage of my life, being independent from my father, I suppose, for the first time. Suddenly I was living on my own for the first time. And also, it coincided with me meeting my girlfriend of the time, who was a vegetarian. So she was actually, if I'm remembering this correctly, she was the first vegetarian I ever knew in my life, which again sounds so strange now in 2020 to think that. But, before the internet and so on, it was a different world. Um, so that that made it very simple all of a sudden. So here was I'd had these vague kind of thoughts, and suddenly I'm with someone who has been vegetarian for quite a long time. To her, it's normal, it's easy, there's no reason not to do it for myself. So I think within a short time of meeting her, I became vegetarian myself. and went through that normal kind of process of learning how to cook, how to look after myself as a vegetarian and so forth. And I don't know if veganism came up at the time or not. I think it probably did. Um, and I managed to rationalize not becoming vegan at the time, which obviously now I regret. I wish I'd gone vegan then. But at the time, as is a very common experience, I was able to persuade myself that, oh, okay, free range eggs, that's not so bad, surely. And, organic milk, that's okay, isn't it? So I turned a blind eye. I didn't investigate what happens in the dairy industry. And it was easy to do that. It's still easy to do that. That's still the norm, is to ignore what happens in animal agriculture.
I have to say I use the same justification for being a meat eater for a number of years. And my claim was like, so you're a vegetarian, but I was a meat eater, and my claim was like, well, you see, I'm trying to buy free range, organic, grass-fed beef, free range chicken, eggs, all of that, like milk, organic milk. But so it's okay to have not only eggs, but also, I try to eat wild fish instead of farmed fish, so
Yeah.
I went with that for maybe 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very similar process, really. So I guess I had a kind of a line that I drew in my own mind anyway, being naive as I was about the dairy and egg industries, which was about killing. So I thought, okay, I don't want to be responsible for animals being killed. So I stopped wearing leather, for example, as part of my own vegetarianism meant getting rid of my leather jacket, which is, part of my uniform as a member of a thrash metal band. And fake leather jackets were not so easy to come by then, certainly too expensive for me. And I got rid of any clothes I had made of wool, that kind of thing. So I was so on the edge of being a vegan. I should have been vegan. The logic of my own position meant I should have been vegan, but I was able to deny certain inconvenient aspects that enable me to be a vegetarian rather than a vegan. So that carried on for, I don't know, I guess about 7 years, like that, more or less. I mean, it's a long time ago now, so I can't reconstruct my thinking entirely from that period.
So you've been vegan and vegetarian, or at least vegetarian, for 20 years, it seems, because you've been vegan for 12, 13.
Yeah, well, I've been vegan now for nearly 16 years.
Oh, 16. Okay. So
And
that
I was
interview I watched was
vegetarian.
older. Okay.
Yeah, and I was vegetarian for about, I think, let me do the maths, about 12 years before that. So I've been vegetarian or vegan for 27 years. That's it.
Wow.
Yeah, 27 years. Yeah.
Wow.
So over half my life now.
Wow.
So yeah, so I carried on like that for a long time, and then I got to the year 2000, and that's when I started thinking about veganism much more seriously. And
From sociological and scientific point of view, not only from the personal point.
No, this was still purely personal at this stage. So this was during my master's degree in the
Okay.
year 2000. I was still studying sociology, so I finished my first degree. Then I moved to a new town, moved to London. My relationship ended with that partner, and I guess it was another period of reinvention for me, I suppose, in some ways.
Mhm.
So at that point, I did become vegan, and I didn't stick with it. I went back to being vegetarian after about a year, and I mean, I felt really bad about that decision. That was like a shameful thing for me. And it didn't last that long. Well, 3 or 4 years, I suppose, before I went vegan again, and for the final time. So that first time I tried it, it was a bit like being in that early position of not yet being vegetarian. I didn't know any vegans at that point. I was in a new environment. And I didn't know what I was doing on a practical point of view. I didn't know how to cook vegan. I've been so used to being a vegetarian, relying on eggs and cheese a lot. as a lot of
Yeah.
vegetarians do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I found myself feeling quite, not great health-wise, because I was eating really badly. I
Hmm.
was eating a lot of junk food,
Hmm.
convenience food.
Beer and
So after
chips.
about, yeah, lots of chips, yeah, um, yeah, white bread, bad stuff, a really bland, boring diet. Um, so I felt myself not feeling great, physically, I suppose, and lapsed back gradually into being vegetarian, which is a more familiar pattern. And then moving again after my master's degree, um, I was in a place where finally I became aware of a sort of vegan subculture around where I was, and of course the internet was taking off, so it suddenly became a lot easier to find out about veganism, to connect with vegan organizations, to find websites. Um, yeah, it was just a lot easier. So the second time I went vegan, the final time, um, I got to a point, again talking to another friend, the same friend who convinced me that there was sociology related to veganism. So we were both vegetarians at the time, and she was asking me about why would I go vegan? Because I suppose I must have been telling her about how I tried being vegan for a year or something. So she was curious, and I said all the reasons about animal exploitation and all of that. And I just, at the end of that conversation, I thought, well, I have to do it. I can't be making these arguments for veganism to someone else and not do it. It's just hypocritical for me. It was. So yeah, I became vegan the next day. Yeah, literally the next day. I cleared all my cupboards of anything not vegan, toiletries, food cupboards, everything. And that was it. And haven't looked back since. So it took a long time to get there, which I can't help but regret, but that's what happened.
Well, our
um,
journey is our journey, so maybe
mm,
we didn't get to where we wish we were at an earlier point of our lives, but that's part of the journey, So
mm,
I've learned not to kind of for myself, I've learned not to kind of judge myself too harshly. Yes, I
mm,
wish I was more proactive and became vegan 20 years before that, but and uh it is what it is. I can't change the past. So I try
mm.
to bring in my Stoic philosophy and say just focus on what you can do and what's under your control, and the past is certainly not. So
Absolutely.
now let's talk a little bit about the definition of veganism here, though, because that's important if we are talking about being vegan, and
Mm,
maybe you can even bring the distinction. And I think most people would know it, but still, let's bring the definition of veganism and perhaps the distinction or differentiation from vegetarianism here. Because one thing I've learned after talking about AI with 250, 60 people is that much of the time, if not all of the time, people have a different definition of the subjects we're talking about. And so
mm.
they end up talking past each other.
Yeah,
And so it's very important to make sure we're on the same page with the definition. So let's do that.
yeah, certainly. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah, it is really important. I think what we've seen a lot in recent years is that there's been a kind of slippage around veganism, and it's become um, it for a lot of people now. It means a plant-based diet. Basically, it means following a plant-based diet. But for me, that's only one. Of course, it's very important, but it's only one component of being vegan, of what veganism is. And for me, veganism is the the kind of lived practice of opposing the exploitation of other animals in whatever form that takes. And obviously, the biggest form, quantitatively speaking, is through animal agriculture. So, of course, a plant based diet is a crucial, essential component of being vegan. But there's a lot more to it than that. So, yeah, and any ways in which other animals are exploited is not vegan, I would say. So, whether that be animal experimentation or using animals for sport or entertainment, all of these things, hunting, obviously, um, all of that is important. And it also includes, of course, destroying the habitats of free living animals through human activities. Um, all of those kind of things as well are problematic. So what I think what that means is that, and this was certainly part of my own journey towards veganism, it was always about that holistic kind of experience. So I think like a lot of people who go vegan, you can't help but focus on food a lot because that is part of your daily experience. So you have to do that to continue living. You have to focus on, okay, how do I do this? How do I look after myself on a plant-based diet? But it was never only about that. It was about everything. So like I said, I went through all my toiletries and so on, and I checked, okay, is this no animal products, and also is there no animal testing involved in this product? If I'm not sure about that, I'm going to get rid of it, and I'm going to educate myself and, replace things or do without things or whatever. Same with clothing. And um, I mean, I never did things like bet on dog racing or something like that, but I certainly wouldn't do it. That's not vegan either. So it extends to a lot of things. Um, all these ways in which humans exploit animals. So that's what it's about for me. It's this opposition to exploitation. And in that, I've for a long time been quite inspired by the first definition of veganism provided by the Vegan Society way back in, I think, 1951 or 52, something like that. And that first definition, I'm going from memory here, I don't have it written down. It was something like um, the doctrine of living without exploiting animals, something like that. It's a very short one sentence definition. And I thought that's fantastic. And, I slightly regret that the Vegan Society moved away from that definition over the years. And now it has a longer definition, which
Yeah,
certainly goes beyond plant-based diets, but I think it loses something by seeming to overcomplicate it. I think that one sentence was fantastic.
yeah, I have to agree with you because that's the original sentence. But I'm looking at the Vegan Society definition right now as we speak, and it's probably a whole paragraph, like 6 lines on my computer, and I have a pretty big screen. And it goes like this: Veganism is a philosophy and a way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as is possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. In dietary terms, it denotes the practice of dispensing with all products derived wholly or partially from animals. So it's a good definition, but I agree with you. I tend to like much more succinct definitions because I think that the longer we go, there is loss. The more vague it becomes. Instead of people try to go longer because it thinks it would be clearer, but I think sometimes it often works the other way around. So perhaps now is the time, since you used to be the former chair of the Vegan Society, maybe now is the time to give us a brief history lesson about the origins of the Vegan Society and Donald Watson's role and other people that you want to bring in, perhaps, just so that we get the benefit of that story in our conversation.
Sure, yeah. Um, Gosh, where can I begin? Well, I mean, the Vegan Society has an interesting backstory, I would say, within the UK vegetarian movement. So within that vegetarian movement, there were vegans before the word vegan existed. So there were people practicing a vegan lifestyle for sure. And there was some debate amongst uh, vegetarians in the UK. I'm sure elsewhere as well, but this is how veganism came to be invented, was in this UK context as a term. There were these debates about things like the dairy industry in particular. Should that be acceptable? And obviously, for a lot of people, no was the answer. So, how should the vegetarian movement respond to that? And in those early days, between World War I and II, I guess, this debate was going on, and before, but this is when it became really intense. The vegetarian society wasn't hospitable to the idea of creating a separate section within itself for these non-dairy vegetarians, if you like. And that became the sort of push for some of these early vegans to set up their own society and come up with a new name to describe the practice. So that was the impetus for it, I guess. And there were, several really important figures in the early time. Donald Watson is the name that kind of is the most well known for a number of reasons. One of the really important reasons is that he did a lot of the early practical work of setting up the vegan society and keeping it going. So he did the actual work of writing a lot of the early publications of the society, their early newsletter, and then their early magazines, and also printing them. He had a duplicating machine at home where you'd have to turn a handle to, make the paper come out, and he'd be filling envelopes and posting them out to members of the new vegan society all over the country. So the society started in 1944 in the UK, and it was run mostly by Donald Watson in his home in Leicester in the UK. And the word vegan was coined by Donald and Dorothy, his future wife. And there's a pretty cool story about this, I think, which when I say we, I mean me and my partner, Kate Stewart, who's another sociologist and vegan, and we work together a lot on our writing. So as part of some research we've been doing, we've been given access to an archive of Donald Watson's letters that he left behind. He passed away in 2005. And in one of these letters that he wrote, he tells this story of how him and Dorothy invented the word vegan on a night out in Leicester. So they were on a night out to a local dance hall, enjoying themselves, talking about these new ideas. What are we going to call this thing? And between them, they came up with the word vegan. And that's their story, which I think is so cool that we now know that publicly, because this hadn't come to light before. It wasn't like a published story, as far as I'm aware. So that happened in the 1940s. The society was established in 1944. And Donald Watson was really, really important for the first several years, keeping it going, doing a lot of this practical work. And then he gradually stepped away from it, and other people, took on a more prominent role and kept the society going. I can't tell the whole history of the society because it's, there's a lot to say there. But I think it's fair to say that it struggled a lot for decades because it was purely voluntary. There were no paid members of staff. You're relying on a lot of goodwill. You're relying on people having enough time, fundraising to keep things going. So I think there were quite a few times when it nearly ceased to exist and stopped publishing its magazine. But it kept going, and as we know by now, has flourished, especially in recent years. It's taken off, as veganism is taking off in many ways. So and part of this early process, when you come up with this new word to explain this new practice, or not a new practice, to put a name to this existing practice and try and differentiate it from vegetarianism. Very shortly after that, this process of debate was undertaken within the society about how are we going to define it. That was an important part of the early work. Okay, we think it means vegetarianism plus not consuming eggs and dairy, for instance. That was the big issue at the time. But how can we define it and explain it to people? And I think it's that process that led to that first definition, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, and that became the official definition. And then it's changed a few times over the years, and generally got longer. Yeah, as you were saying.
Let me ask you this. Some people say that veganism is probably the fastest growing social movement. Is it and others say, oh no, that's just a diet or something like that. So you're a sociologist. Is it a social movement, and is it true to say it's the fastest growing social movement?
Well, I can't answer the second question because I don't know, because I'm not a sociologist of social movements as such. So that there are other sociologists who are more expert in that. Um, so that's kind of outside my expertise, really. I think it certainly is fair to call it a social movement, and I think, as with probably every social movement, you have fractures, fragmentation, you have external forces appropriating veganism, co-opting veganism, undermining veganism, lots of complex stuff going on. So it's very difficult to speak of one unified vegan movement, I think. I think you could have said that in the early years because it was a relatively small number of people and they did share, a lot of common goals and a shared vision. But over time, of course, people have different ideas about what the focus should be. And that's certainly the case now. Um, but I do think there is still a very clear focus among a significant proportion of people who identify as vegans on not that early definition as such, but the spirit of that definition. I think that still motivates a great number of vegans. This general mission to oppose and ultimately overthrow, replace exploitation with a more peaceful way, a more compassionate way of living with other animals. Um, but then around that, you do have this increasing focus on plant-based diets, which is not necessarily a bad thing, of course, as such. But I think the risk is if that comes to be seen as what veganism is all about, then a lot of other important things get lost. And if the reasons for pursuing a plant-based diet are ultimately anthropocentric, then it's entirely possible that we can continue exploiting other animals for all kinds of other reasons that are unrelated to diet, and they don't necessarily get disturbed or critiqued through that process. So it's insufficient. In terms of whether it's the fastest growing, like I was saying, I don't know enough about social movements, but certainly my feeling is that the growth is rapid, quite sudden. I wouldn't say it's unexpected because I've thought ever since I became vegan and started thinking about it sociologically that veganism is such a good idea that it's entirely possible that at any moment in history it could be like that and things could change very fast. I've always felt that. Um, we're getting into other areas of sociology perhaps now, thinking of I'm thinking of some of the barriers that prevent or attempt to prevent veganism taking off, which are certainly very significant. But yeah, it's always been ready to go. It's right back in 1944 it was ready.
Isn't that absolutely amazing? You're sharing with us, and I agree with you that like in the 90s, there was hardly any literature. You couldn't meet anyone who is vegetarian, let alone vegan. But imagine the 90s, and then imagine World War II, 1944, and yet there were people who were vegan. And as you said, even before that, the debates within the whole sort of UK vegetarian society between vegetarians and non-dairy vegetarians, as they were referred to as sometimes. So that's even more pioneering than that. It's like crazy. And now it's actually become so easy because there's so many easy vegan replacements, vegan milks, explicitly vegan brands and restaurants, and like McDonald's and Burger King and all those fast food restaurants are going vegan with some of their meals, for God's sake, right? So it's like we're talking at a whole other level of convenience and awareness today. And which brings me to one area where you are actually an expert in, and that's the perception of veganism in the media. Because like part of that, meteoric or explosive growth of veganism is the coverage of veganism in media. So tell us about how's that work? What's the general media image of veganism? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it masculine? Is it feminine? What can we learn from that whole thing?
Sure. Well, here I think we can see some positive changes starting to happen, but it's from a very negative base, I would say. So when I started researching this systematically, I suppose I could say, with a colleague, Karen Morgan, another sociologist, we in particular looked at the coverage of veganism in newspapers in the UK. This is back in 2008 we began this research because, as vegans ourselves, we experience a lot of kind of negative opinions around veganism. And certainly at that time, we got this general sense that it was a kind of hostile cultural atmosphere around veganism. But as good sociologists, we wanted to test that out. Anecdote is not good enough. So when we did this research, certainly we found that we were right. Our hunches were correct, that the coverage of veganism was overwhelmingly negative in UK newspapers at that time. So there were a whole bunch of anti-vegan stereotypes that were really, really commonplace, and almost no what we categorized as positive coverage of veganism. And by positive coverage, we meant something quite modest, really, which is just explaining the reasons for veganism, something that's simple. So not even saying veganism's great or a good idea or go vegan, not even that level, but just even this is why you might consider going vegan because of, animal exploitation or, environmental reasons or whatever.
Can
There
you
was
give us
even
the
almost
negative
none of that.
image compared to that? Like, because there's a lack of positive image, and your very modest way of measuring that is helpful here.
Yeah.
But what's kind of the negative representation that you found, the most predominant features of that, perhaps?
Yeah. I think, well, we did come up with a bunch of categories, again, as sociologists like to do, and we came up with 6 different stereotypes that were the most common in newspapers. And I'm going off the top of my head now. So the most common one we saw was simply ridiculing veganism and ridiculing vegans. So just saying things like, of course, this is a crazy idea. Why would anyone do this? And what's behind that is this assumption that the newspapers are addressing a non-vegan audience. They are writing for non-vegans. So if you're reading this as a vegan, straight away you're alienated from this discourse. And after that flat out ridiculing of vegans, you have this idea that veganism is impossible, like practically impossible. So you get coverage that gives the impression that you just can't do it. Like on a day-to-day basis, how can one possibly live as a vegan? It's just forget about it. It's too hard. And our interpretation of that is it's partly a way to make people feel more comfortable with not being vegan. It's like, okay, yeah, it's too hard. The newspaper's telling me it's too hard. I thought it's probably too hard. Okay, I'll forget about it. Maybe it's a nice idea, but no, I won't go there. And then alongside that, you get this idea that vegans are in some ways special in terms of being really focused on denying ourselves pleasure in some way, like giving this idea that so plant-based diets, for example, are just unpleasant. The food's horrible. There's limited choice or whatever it might be.
Boring.
Boring, yeah, boring, very common one. Bland food. So to be vegan, you've got to have some kind of, incredible, strong will to to eat this terrible food. And of course, my first experience of vegan was terrible. So, but that was my own lack of understanding of all the great things I could do. So there's that one. And I'm probably going to forget one. The idea that veganism is a fad, that it's just something like a phase people go through, like a teenage
Coming of age.
Yeah, like a coming of age thing, and then you grow out of it, sort of thing. Is that
Rebellious
idea?
kind of, anti-establishment period of
Yeah,
our lives.
yeah. And that's very much connected with coverage of celebrity vegans, what we might call celebrity vegans, and especially this kind of celebratory coverage of when a famous vegan stops being vegan. So then the newspapers were like, oh, all over that. It's like, see, we told you it was impossible. This famous person says they've stopped being vegan. That proves it. So there's some of that going on. The idea that vegans are sentimental was another one, a fairly common one. So this idea that there's something to do with eating meat in particular that's somehow connected to understanding the reality of nature as being, fundamentally violent, unequal, the survival of the fittest, and all that kind of idea. And this notion that somehow vegans are disconnected from this fundamental truth and that we're all, completely naive about the way the world works. That's a common one, which is a really strange one, I think. And then the last one, if I've remembered them all, is this idea that vegans are hostile, that in some sense we are extremists and that we're out to cause social disorder through various forms of activism or just through breaking social norms. So it's quite a powerful collection of stuff to contend with.
Where does femininity come here? Because there's also femininity, masculinity play here.
Yeah,
that
sure.
You're not man enough. You're not a macho guy. You're not like man's man unless you have a steak stuffed in your mouth.
Oh, yeah.
So, and the vegans are kind of sissies, skinny and kind of feminine weaklings who surely are not good at sports. They're kind of artsy and nerdy with glasses and everything. They can't do sports, let alone martial arts or anything like that. Totally not. Or weightlifting or any other like seriously demanding athletic activity.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's been there since forever. One of the ways that played out in particular in this piece of research was with this idea of vegans being sentimental. That's very much a feminized stereotype. It's a sexist stereotype at the same time as being an anti-vegan stereotype. So often you would have women vegans being kind of singled out in newspaper coverage and portrayed as if they are naive and overly emotional. And again, they don't understand the reality of nature being red in tooth and claw and that kind of idea.
The rational man eats steaks.
Yeah, of course. And many other people have researched this. Carol Adams is probably a name you're aware of. If any listeners aren't aware, if you look up Carol J. Adams, you can find out a lot more about her work. The Sexual Politics of Meat is her most famous book, which has been reprinted many times. And she gets right into that whole issue of how a particular form of masculinity is very much associated with red meat eating in particular. So there's that whole aspect of it as well. But one thing I want to add to that is that what we thought was perhaps the most surprising thing of all, we sort of expected these stereotypes would be there, maybe not to this extent, but what did surprise us was that veganism was disconnected from animals. And we found that really strange. So even all these negative stereotypes, they're focused on vegans ourselves. And it's almost as if that's being done in order to not talk about other animals. So there's this disconnection. So we kind of went in expecting we'd see negative coverage of, say, animal rights activists and saying, they're hostile or something. And yes, that coverage is there, but it was disconnected from veganism. So if you have coverage of animal rights activism, well, in the sample we looked at, it wouldn't be discussed that they were vegan, if you see what I mean. They were separated out.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought that was actually quite significant, because what it meant was that when readers were experiencing this discourse about veganism, they weren't ever really being confronted with the motivation for veganism, the reason for veganism, the reason why it exists. in the first place, which is all about opposing animal exploitation. And we do know from lots of research that although there are a range of motivations for being vegan, uh, animal rights, to use that as a sort of catch-all term, is, if not the most important, one of the most important, and has been since as long as veganism existed. And often when people go vegan for whatever reason, that becomes part of the reason. So even if people start following a plant-based diet for personal health, it's common that people then start to learn more, read more, and they keep adding more reasons for being vegan, and makes it a more kind of stable identity, I suppose. So that was kind of written out of the picture in this negative coverage, which that did surprise us, and that made it seem far worse, really, because anti-vegan stereotypes are annoying and unpleasant. Sometimes they might be harmful, perhaps, depending on the extent and the consequences of them, but they're nowhere near as serious as what happens to animals themselves. And that's why we're doing it. Well, speaking for myself, that's why I'm vegan. That's what's important to me. I don't really care if people make fun of me for being a vegan, but I do care if in the process of making fun of me, other people might be dissuaded from being vegan themselves, and therefore, losing that opportunity to assist this movement to grow more quickly and be of assistance to animals more quickly. So that's where we thought that was a serious problem,
So how
a
do we
more serious
explain
problem.
if there was this kind of prevalent negative image in the media? How do we explain then that despite that fact, still veganism is exploding everywhere, not only in the UK, but North America, even in the second and third world? Like it's really everywhere. It's like unbelievable. 6 years ago, my most so far my most impressive vegan restaurant I've ever been to, and the most amazing and delicious vegan meal I've ever had, was, for example, in Moscow. And I was shocked and surprised to find that, because me and my wife did about 2 week traveling in Russia, probably 5 or 6 years ago. Well, no, 3 or 4 years ago, I think. And we were a little concerned because, we were going to all kinds of places, and we were a little concerned with like being able to find vegan meals everywhere we went. But we never had a problem once. And as I said, we were amazed, especially in a place like Moscow. We were amazed of the options and how good and easy that is. And it's even like world quality. It's like one of the best I've had, at least. Right? So how do we explain those two things? Like, on the one hand, it's exploding everywhere. On the other hand, it had these negative images and elements associated with it.
I think, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot that's gone on there to produce that change. I think one thing about the negative coverage itself is that the effects aren't always negative, or aren't necessarily negative, because I think what you will often find is that the public who are consuming these discourses, they're not always going to be convinced by them. And you can see this in many social movements. If you see an anti-feminist backlash, which keeps recurring, of course, there are many people who read that kind of stuff and they're not going to be convinced. They're not going to say, oh yeah, feminism, that's a terrible idea. They're going to read that and say, this is a reactionary backlash. So I'm going to disidentify from the backlash and identify with feminism. So it can even have a perverse effect, if you like, of pushing people in the opposite direction to the intention of the negative stereotype. And so even though the stereotypes were negative, the sheer volume of coverage was increasing all the time. So the piece of research I've been talking about was just a snapshot of 1 year. But if you take a longer term view and you look at the coverage of veganism over decades, you see this incredible, a curve. You can see that on the camera, very steep and getting steeper all the time, year on year. And we haven't published research on this, but we hope to at some point, is to take this sort of longer term view. So just the fact that it becomes more part of everyday discourse, even if the coverage is negative, some people are going to see that and, as I say, disidentify from the negative coverage, but also be curious. Okay, what is this thing that's I'm noticing more and more? And they can find out. And of course, these days it's a lot easier to find out through the internet and so forth. But also, of course, all through this time, vegans have been working really, really hard, doing their best against, a lot of obstacles to promote veganism through all the kind of grassroots work that's familiar across lots of social movements, protesting, holding festivals and fairs, street stalls, delivering leaflets, publishing magazines, creating websites, recipe blogs, taking cakes into work, all the kind of everyday practices that vegans do, as well as the more kind of scaled up forms of activism, if you like. All of that has been going on. And of course, many, many vegans have made veganism their livelihood by starting vegan restaurants or all kinds of vegan companies, or indeed trying to get an academic career based on veganism, as I've had. And I'm certainly not alone in that. And that's been a really welcome change that I've noticed in the last few years, is lots and lots of vegan academics in sociology and beyond doing work on veganism, which is very exciting. So I think there's a lot of things have gone into that. It's no matter how strong the opposition is, it's impossible to suppress knowledge about veganism these days, or to hide it effectively, or to deny it. Vegans are very vocal, have access to the tools to disseminate information. So yeah, I think the lid is coming off, as it were.
Maybe, I don't know if this is the best time to bring this in, but I watched one of your previous presentations and you were talking about a breaching experiment. Can you perhaps walk us through what is a breaching experiment and give us an example and how it is relevant to our conversation here, perhaps?
Sure. I don't remember what presentation that was from, but in general terms, a breaching experiment means to sort of to break a social convention of some kind, and see what the consequences are. And the consequences reveal a lot about the function of that social convention. So this was something that was done by sociologists, decades ago, just to sort of test out how do people function in terms of day-to-day interactions, and what happens if you disturb that, even in quite small ways. I don't mean acts of violence or anything, but a classic one is to maybe hold someone's gaze on the street an instant longer than would be conventionally normal. And what happens? People become uncomfortable very quickly. They'll perceive it as threatening in some way. I don't recommend anyone does this, but you can do it as a thought experiment, because we're aware ourselves, if we feel ourselves being looked at for a second or two longer than normal, we'll start thinking, why is that happening? So yeah, forgive me, I can't remember the context that I was talking about that in a presentation, but that's the general idea of what a breaching experiment would be.
So is it a breaching experiment, for example, when, let's say, me and my wife, we're going to her family's Thanksgiving reunion, and she's a Italian Catholic, sort of like from an Italian Catholic family. And it's sort of like North American Italian Catholic family. So it's very heavy meat kind of focused. So, turkey, or in the summer, steaks and burgers all the time, multiple times, bacon and eggs and stuff. So let's say, is it a bridging experiment when me and my wife sit on the Thanksgiving dinner and we're vegan and everyone around us is like heavy meat eater? Or even like in another way, when you were sort of a teenager in that rock band and you were the only non-drinker in an environment when everyone is a heavy drinker. Isn't that not another example of a breaching experiment?
It was certainly conflicting with the social norms. Yeah, to be a non-drinking guitarist in a thrash metal band, I think I was alone. Um, I don't know if it would constitute a breaching experiment. I mean, a breaching experiment tends to be something that you would do sort of deliberately, um, almost almost sort of provocatively, I would say. Whereas if you're, I mean, certainly if you're a vegan attending some kind of function, some kind of meal where consuming animal products is the norm, yes, you are breaching social norms. I don't know if it fits with breaching experiment, but I'm getting bogged down in the jargon of sociology here.
Yeah, no, the
But
point I'm trying to bring here is that there's that kind of a peer pressure,
mm,
sociological pressure issue here that you faced when you were non-drinking in a thrash metal band, and my experience, which is much shorter than yours, obviously being a vegan, is that being a vegan, the biggest cost of being a vegan for me so far has been these kind of a social, at
mm,
best case scenario, socially awkward moments, and
mm,
at worst case scenario, like moments where you could have some kind of level of sort of a confrontation, even,
mm,
if you will, even if, like, let's say we're not like at the proselytizing kind of vegan level, and we're not pushing others aggressively to don't eat this and don't do that, but we're kind of like quietly just saying that we're vegan. Sometimes it can provoke kind of an aggressive reaction. But even in the
mm.
best case scenarios, when you're just like with a bunch of friends or very close family, it still does create a lot of friction, and there's costs. Oh, but you're vegan, we have to figure out what to do for you, and all that
Mhm.
stuff, and that creates certain kind of you know uh, friction and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was getting bogged down in the terminology. I apologize for that, of breaching experiment. But no, you're absolutely right. And I think I mean, the early vegans, if I can call them that, in the, through the 40s and 50s, this was a big concern of the vegan movement.
Imagine for them,
Because,
it must have been awful. Like, if it's hard even today, in that sense, that's my biggest cost. Like, because
yeah,
convenience now is like not an issue. It's so easy. There's tons of literature. You can educate yourself how to cook. That's all. We've overcome that. To me, it seems right now the last kind of big impediment is, or the major impediment that we have to overcome, is this kind of social issue, especially in traditional societies, or families where you have the ritualistic consumption of animal-based foods
mm,
on any major occasion, like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and so on and so on.
yeah. No, no, I completely agree with you. This is a huge issue, and that was recognized right from the beginning. So even when veganism was a lot less convenient than it is now, it was still recognized then that the social impact was much more difficult at that time, more difficult to overcome, to cope with on a sort of personal level. What do you do if people around you are suspicious or hostile or feel threatened or whatever it might be, or any combination of that? And I think that's still the case, and still a lot of people who go vegan, even if on a practical level it's straightforward, coping with these social issues is still a big deal. And especially if you feel isolated, and you may well, even if you're connected through the internet or whatever, you could be isolated within your household, within your family. Um, if one partner is not vegan,
That's a big
um,
issue, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, and there, all kinds of power dynamics can come into play there that obviously happen in families,
Hmm.
um, within couples, between parents and children, all of that kind of thing. That is a big issue, and I think this is where you know social support is really, really important, and we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that, because I think, well, on the one hand, I do agree with you that it's absolutely a lot easier than it's ever been, but I think there still are a lot of structural barriers to veganism within the way society is organized. So of course not everybody has equal access to a healthy plant-based diet. Probably everybody pretty much can access unhealthy plant-based food because that's everywhere, like you were saying, chips. Um, but getting, fresh fruit and vegetables and whole grains and all of that is still not straightforward for everybody by any means. So there is still a lot of work to be done there. But even if that is available, the social issues can be, very, very difficult indeed, very challenging. I mean, for me personally, I feel very lucky in lots of ways that I didn't really have that in my own life. I think because I was living alone, I guess, when I made these changes, that that makes it very, very simple. There was no one to negotiate with about that. No one who was being upset or threatened by me on a day-to-day basis within my home. But I certainly know plenty of vegans who have been through that process. And I mean, there is published research on this as well about the difficulties that vegans encounter socially, and also the awareness that you may well be stigmatized for being vegan, and that can be a factor that counts against your decision to go vegan. You may think, well, it's just going to be too difficult for me. It's going to be too unpleasant, not in terms of eating food or whatever, but in terms of people's reactions. So, and again, I think this is quite a common thing that people will delay going vegan until, say, they leave the parental home, for example, or until a relationship ends or whatever it might be.
This is, I think, the moment where we kind of slowly, or should kind of go into sort of how all these ideas that we've been laying the groundwork for with respect to veganism actually relate to the usual topics I cover here, which are transhumanism, artificial intelligence, and technology. And speaking exactly on what you're just saying, I meet a lot of transhumanists who are totally sold on the logic behind the idea of being vegan. They get it. Here's where they fail to make that step. So you're giving an example of, like, when my partner is ready, or all those other things. But the transhumanist example that I meet the most is like, well, I'll be vegan when we have lab-grown meat, So that's kind of like a classic transhumanist response. How do you feel about that?
Well, disappointed is my first response to that. I think, yeah, I don't know where I can begin with that really, um, because if you, as you say, if you're sold on the logic of it, if you're convinced by the reasoning for veganism, and the fact is, it is so much simpler now for a great many people. I can't think why you wouldn't do it unless there is some kind of incredible social barrier in your life that maybe there is some, people in your family would be outraged and ostracize you or something, which that happens, but I don't imagine that's really the reason behind many of the people saying that kind of thing.
I think you get straight to the core behind the reasoning of that behavior with the quote that I started with today, and that Jenny's great book finishes with, which is, so let me give it again: coming up with technical fixes rather than ethical reform, revolution, rebellion. Every time the technology tries to stand in for ethics, we do ourselves a disservice. We deny ourselves the opportunity for growth. I think that's exactly nailing it for us, unfortunately, as transhumanists. People want a technological fix. They want a magic pill that solves the problem. They want a magic fix for climate change. They want a magic fix for the suffering of the animals by having, petri dish meat, so that they can still have their cake and eat it too. They want no sacrifice. They don't want to make any sacrifice. They don't want to make any personal behavioral changes whatsoever. They just want it easy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of the quote. Yeah, no, of course, I'm not going to disagree with myself. But I think that's very true. And I mean, there's a few things that come to mind thinking of that. On the one hand, veganism is already a low tech response, I would say, because this sense of dependence on animal products, dependence in terms of familiarity, tradition, social conventions, taste preferences, which are formed in childhood before we can articulate them. We're given things to eat. We are told animal products are delicious before we can even say if we like it or not.
Yeah,
All of
for
that
me,
happens.
every time when I used to get sick before I went vegan, or when I feel down and depressed, or for whatever case, even when I had a headache, one of the easy fixes for me was milk and cookies.
Hmm.
And that immediately takes me to that childhood moment where I had these biscuits, at home, and a glass of milk, and I have a biscuit with the milk, and it melts in my mouth, and I'm immediately, 5-year-old kid eating
Hmm.
milk and cookies, and everything is safe around me, and I'm happy as I can be.
Yeah.
Like immediately transports me back in that time.
Hmm. Yeah, it's enormously powerful. The symbolism of food, the associations of food, the emotional significance, absolutely. Um, and I think when you, as I say, go for the low tech version of veganism, let's say, and you go through that, fantastic process of learning how to cook new things, experiment with different plant foods, and every vegan I know who's gone through this process just comes out of it saying, I had no idea, there's so many delicious foods out there. It's amazing. I eat more widely now. I'm more creative. I enjoy food more. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable or unwell any longer, all of this. And so, yes, you're doing yourself an ethical disservice and so forth, but you're also doing yourself a disservice because you're just limiting your creativity and your ability to experience the world as a human being and all that it has to offer. There is such abundance of a cornucopia of experiences from plant-based living that people are largely unaware of because they're socialized into these conventional ways of consuming animal products that are really very limited, I find. So people who are used to consuming animal products, it's often a narrow range of things that people cycle through. And I think you can see that from the ease with which we communicate about them when we talk about burgers, steaks, whatever it might be. There's this quite narrow set of things that people are very familiar with and eat as a matter of routine without
Eggs and
thinking.
bacon.
Yeah, exactly.
Or in England, bangers and mash.
Bangers and mash, fish and chips, as you were saying earlier,
Yeah,
all
yeah.
of these things. So we have these emotional, they have emotional resonance and they take us back to childhood and all of this. But at the same time, that is limiting us hugely. And that sense of kind of comfort that you can get, I think um, you can do something much more effective than that as a vegan. I think through being more aware of the connections that we have with other animals and making those more compassionate and peaceful and so on. So the kind of inward looking sense of comfort that you might associate with animal products, if you can replace that with creating your own plant-based forms of comfort, recreating them as a vegan, and then thinking, okay, this is giving me a wonderful feeling of, it's pleasurable and it's got all the taste that I like. And no one else is being hurt for me to be able to enjoy this. It just amplifies the pleasure. And to say no one is being hurt is a big claim, of course, because we're aiming to eliminate exploitation, and getting there is very difficult because the whole food system is set up to almost to produce harm, not just for other animals, but for workers in the food system and all these other issues. But having that ambition to look after yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that, in a way which connects you rather than disconnects you. Um, so, so yeah. So going back to my initial reaction of disappointment, it is disappointing, and I'm disappointed for people as well that you would choose to not go through that just exciting experience that becoming vegan certainly can be, despite a lot of the problems that we've discussed of social stigma and so on and so forth. Um, so yeah, it's on a personal level, it's difficult for me to relate to that, that idea of waiting for someone else to invent something that makes me feel better, when I know that I can make myself feel better now by going vegan. It's peculiar.
Another argument for veganism that I've given, when I did go vegan, probably a year or two afterwards. Well, I forget the exact time frame, but sometime afterwards, there were so many people asking me why, like from my fan base from my podcast, why did you go vegan? So that I actually had to write a little article, and I forget if it was like 5 or 6 reasons why I went vegan. And, I gave the classic ones, animal rights, my health, climate change, all of those things. But one of the sort of like usually kind of, well, very rarely, if ever, mentioned reason to go vegan that I gave there is not a reason that's very popular among vegans themselves. And I've never actually heard it from any non-tech vegans before, but is the following. So I want to sort of get your kind of input on it. The idea right now is that our claim with respect to animals often comes from this sort of a power perspective. And usually it's like an intellectual power perspective, which is to say, we put the claim we are smarter than you, therefore we can kill you, we can eat you, etc. And my argument was like, look, if we were ever in the reverse situation, let's say we have artificial intelligence coming to exist at some point in the 21st century, or let's say we get in touch with an alien civilization of aliens, and, we are then the stupid species. We are then the dum-dums, or supposedly. We are, infinitely stupider than, let's say, artificial general intelligence could be, at least theoretically. And then if they embrace the same logic and reasoning that we have today with respect to our fellows, the animals, then we shouldn't be surprised if they end up treating us exactly the same way. So I argued that one of the reasons why I went vegan is that I want to set a good precedent of how a higher intelligence species can treat, lower intelligence species, but still sentient species, as equals and treat them with dignity and respect, so that while we have no guarantee that would be the case, that we would get that sort of treatment from aliens or AIs, but at least we can set the precedent, and we can say, because then they can say, well, look, we just do as you did to others, but now you're the stupid one, so we have also the right to kill you and enslave you and play with you for sports and kill you on a mass scale and put you in sort of like concentration camps and all of that stuff, right? And actually, you brought in one of your articles that I read the Doctor Who example of how, was it in the 60s or something, when there was this episode about aliens hunting humans for their meat for consumption. The Doctor actually became vegetarian for a brief period of time. So to me, that's a very legitimate issue personally, and an issue that I thought should get some more sort of friction, or it would spread better among the transhumanists and singularitarians. Though I don't have any evidence that it actually did. I may have been optimistic or too optimistic about that.
Well, I think it's a great idea, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a common idea in science fiction to, of course, have this notion of aliens coming to Earth and treating us as livestock, even literally, or in other ways, kind of exploiting humans for for labor, or just exterminating us, or all of these kinds of ideas. And certainly in Doctor Who, it's a very common theme. You often have the character of the Doctor defending human beings from some technologically superior alien species, and having this kind of ethical basis for his defense. And so when the episode that you mentioned there was from the 1980s, actually, when the Doctor becomes vegetarian, and the the man who wrote the script, Robert Holmes, wrote the script for that episode. He was a vegetarian himself. So clearly he was, from that ethical basis, making this connection between the doctor's, the character of the doctor's ethical stance and following the logical consequences of that stance. If those are his ethics, then of course he would have to be vegetarian. Well, vegan, I would say now, because it doesn't make sense for him to be otherwise. If he's protecting human beings from superior species, why wouldn't he also protect inferior species from human beings? There's no logical reason for that, other than that's just the conventional kind of human exceptionalism that we all are socialized into. So yeah, certainly. And I remember years ago when I was involved in the Vegan Society, there was a program of educational talks, school talks about veganism. So the idea was that speakers would go into schools and explain veganism. And one of the thought experiments you could do with children, with students, is along those kinds of lines. Imagine how you would feel if, an alien species suddenly came down to Earth and said to you, right, all of you, you've got to get under your desks now. You're not allowed to get back out. That's where you live now. You wouldn't do something quite that frightening, depending on the age of the students, but that general kind of idea, just as a way to encourage empathy. And so, okay, well, this is basically what we do to other animals. Why? Just because we can. There is no ethical basis for it. So, I think that's, I think it's a persuasive argument, and maybe, you should keep going back to it and keep pushing that argument. I think it's.
I don't think it has gotten enough traction, unfortunately. I have tried that for the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years. It's not gotten enough traction. I don't think. Part of the reason, maybe, and I'm speculating here, is that, a lot of people in our community, in transhumanist, singularitarian communities, perceive us as this kind of exceptionalist, supreme beings, probably the only intelligence that we know in the known universe, the smartest species on the planet, the species that would merge with the machines and populate the universe, the species that would become gods. So all of these kind of weigh very heavy on our exceptionalism, and therefore they really can't make, that's my speculation anyway, they can't make the connection because we're just so different from all the other animals and everything else around us.
Yeah, I think that kind of interpretation or extrapolation of transhumanism perhaps fits really well with conventional human exceptionalism. It's amplifying it.
Absolutely.
So I can see, I can see that it's kind of seductive. If you're already of that mindset, then this is giving you more of that good stuff of feeling like, oh yeah, I'm even more powerful, as you say, becoming like gods. Whereas veganism for me is very much about humility.
Exactly.
And seeing humans alongside other animals who are different. Of course, there are plenty of things other animals can do that we can't do. And yes, there are things we can do that other animals can't do as well. But so what? It makes no ethical difference. So yeah, that is an interesting one. And yeah, keep going with it, I would say. Sometimes these ideas take time.
I hope so. I'm not planning to give up anytime soon, but it's just I've been kind of disappointed. So I've been even sort of debating with myself if it's my fault, if I'm making a poor argument, or if it's the way I'm saying it, or if it's just the way it's perceived, or where's the problem I'm trying to figure out. But it's anyway, but I'm not planning to give up. So hopefully it would improve over time. What do you say to people who would tell you, well, look, you're expressing a profound misunderstanding of nature, and you're talking about your own humility here, but you have to express humility and respect the natural ways, and nature is about tooth and claw, and about survival of the fittest. And if you look in nature, predators consume other animals all the time, and it just happens so that we're tigers, we're lions, we're not herbivores, we're lions.
Yeah, well,
and
I suppose my
that comes
first,
from that paleo. We are
yeah,
Neanderthals, and or maybe not Neanderthals, but part of us, and all of our ancestors were these kind of Cro-Magnons, or Stone Age people who had to kill all these big animals, the mastodons and mammoths and whatever, and to survive, to eat them, basically.
yeah,
So that's normal to us. That's natural. That's who we are.
yeah, absolutely. I think my first response always to that is like, who cares? If it's natural or not, it doesn't mean we have to do it. We have other ways of living now, so it's irrelevant to me. Even if that were true, right? I wouldn't care. We can change the way we want to live. We don't have to do that. I mean,
And
self-evidently,
which is precisely the point about transhumanism that unfortunately, again, most people are missing, because transhumanism is supposedly all about change, all about evolving to the next step, making that progress. But unfortunately, people get stuck, I think, on the technological end of things, and forego the personal evolution of their sort of intellectual, spiritual, and especially ethical capacities and capabilities.
yeah. So I've always had that kind of first response of like, well, so what kind of thing. And if there are elements of our nature, even if that were true, that were harmful, then that's something for us to work on. I think it's not like an excuse to do exactly what we want. But also, I think these ideas of who we are, they are social constructs as well. We're cherry picking from the archaeological record to construct a vision of ourselves that legitimates doing exactly what we've been doing and not changing and staying the same. As you were saying, it's denying yourself this opportunity for change, for evolution, for growth, or whatever. Which is, yeah, again, just kind of disappointing. Why would you want to do that? But also, and this has been pointed out by other people, that there is no kind of homogeneous human history as regards to any social practice, whether that be hunting or diet or whatever, because human populations have been dispersed and we've lived in different environments and we've had different diets. It's certainly not the case that all humans were hunting mastodons. Depends on a particular climate conditions and et cetera, et cetera. So if you're living in a place that has more abundant plant foods available, you're going to eat them. It's an easier way to live. And the archaeological record of hunting and so forth has been glamorized, but it also tends to preserve better. Flint arrowheads preserve better than a pile of excreted fruit seeds. We didn't need any tools. We didn't need to invent tools to eat an apple or whatever. So there's this kind of fetishization of nature being violent, or human nature being violent, and stuff that I don't buy it anyway. But as I say, even if it was true, it's like, I don't care. It's irrelevant. So yeah, I'm a bit dismissive of that kind of argument, I suppose.
Are you familiar? Because transhumanism, just like veganism, is a very wide hat, and there's all kinds of spectrums and corners and parts of that big society, and so you have people very much on the right, Ayn Randian right, and then you have people who are like sort of like socialists, communists, anarchists, all kinds. But one of the sort of the founder of the UK transhumanist movement, also pretty good philosopher, is David Pearce. So I don't know, are you familiar with the hedonistic imperative, sometimes referred to as the abolitionist project?
No, I don't
you're not
believe
familiar.
so.
So David Pearce is the guy who in the sort of 90s founded the UK transhumanist movement, which eventually became I think the Global Transhumanist Association. Eventually it became Humanity Plus. He's been vegetarian, I think, for all his life, and vegan for, I don't know, decades probably. And so he goes in the other end of the spectrum with his the hedonistic imperative, and it's like a very kind of a substantial piece of work that he wrote like a couple of decades ago. But basically, if I were to read a little part from the abstract on his website, he says, the hedonistic imperative abstract, he says, this manifesto outlines a strategy to eradicate suffering in all sentient life. The abolitionist project is ambitious, implausible, but technically feasible. It is defended here on ethical utilitarian grounds. Genetic engineering and nanotechnology allow Homo sapiens to discard the legacy wetware of our evolutionary past. Our post-human successors will rewrite the vertebrate genome, redesign the global ecosystem, and abolish suffering throughout the living world. So, so if I were to say it briefly, I would say he wants to make the whole ecosystem vegan in some sense, and he wants to remove all suffering. So the lions would lie with the lambs, and we can do all of that through genetic manipulation and genetic engineering, so that there's no suffering, and of course the lions don't remain hungry, and the lambs don't get eaten and all that stuff. What is your take? And of course, I'm kind of grossly oversimplifying his work, so I suggest you go and check it out, because it's been written probably early 2000s, if not in the 90s. But what's your take on sort of that kind of transhumanist, hardcore vegan sort of, so utopia, even some have called it, where not only humans have the responsibility of being vegan, but we have a responsibility to impose that to, and as you were saying in the beginning, the key part of the definition of veganism is that, you know, we diminish suffering and exploitation of animals. Well, he's going one step further, and he says it's our responsibility to exterminate, to completely remove that from the cosmos.
Well, I mean, for me, suffering isn't part of the definition of veganism. It's a consequence of removing exploitation. Is that a consequence of that is that suffering will be hugely diminished, but not eliminated. I suppose pointless suffering at human hands will be eliminated, but that's a different thing. I think some people maybe, well, apparently do approach veganism from a suffering point of view rather than an exploitation point of view, but I approach it from an exploitation point of view. So that's not my imperative. And I mean, my inclination is to think it's going to be a bad idea to interfere. What's got us in this terrible situation now, where we have a world with more suffering than ever before? If we talk about the volume of creatures who are being exploited and having pain inflicted on them and being killed very young and so forth, that is a result of genetic manipulation, you know, selective breeding to serve our own purposes. And this kind of ambition, again, sounds like serving our own purposes. It sounds self-aggrandizing, you know, becoming gods, giving ourselves the power to change all other life, not only ourselves. And of course, a lot of people, I'm not a philosopher, but I think a lot of philosophers will argue that suffering is of value. You know, it's suffering is the context against which you value not suffering, okay, of reaching a state of peace or safety or survival, and more than that, empathy. You know, being able to empathize with the sufferings of others is crucially important to making us compassionate. And this is just, you know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head because it's the first time I've encountered this idea. So I've not had time to think this through very well, but these are the first kind of thoughts that come to my mind about it. So it's not something that sounds especially attractive to me.
Well, I sympathize with you, even though I'm vegan like you are, and like David Pierce is. I have more concerns about his idea than than. I mean, I'm more like where you are, to be honest with you. However, I just would recommend you go check it out because it's still a very impressive and as he says
Sure.
in the beginning in the abstract, implausible, but technically possible possibility on mere utilitarian philosophical grounds. And he lays down a whole philosophical framework for it where he addresses that issue of suffering, by the way, if I remember, even though it's been now probably 10 years since I last read it. So maybe I should reread it too. But Matthew, it's been now almost 2 hours since we started our conversation. So I want to ask you, is there maybe the last 2 or 3 questions here before we have to let you go, but is there any other issue that I didn't ask you about pertaining to veganism, and perhaps any issue that you can see how veganism can illuminate our understanding perhaps of technology or artificial intelligence or transhumanism, or any other important thing that you want to bring to our attention that I didn't ask you about?
I'm not sure really. I suppose one thing that maybe I'd like to emphasize is how important it is that we pay attention to social structures in all of these kinds of debates and the context within which we're living and thinking and having these ideas, and the constraints which many humans are under, as well as many other animals, of course, and how democratic these ideas are and where they're coming from demographically, geographically, and so forth. I think that's always important to bear in mind. So I suppose one of the things that sociology brings, not me personally, but as a discipline to the study of veganism, is this attention to social structure and trying to get us away from the idea that these are purely personal individual decisions. So we have our own biographical stories of becoming vegan or not and so forth, but they all happen within a social context, within historical context, and we're always connected to those contexts through our decisions, and our decisions are shaped by those contexts. So that's something I really want to emphasize, because I think sometimes, I'm not talking about you or our conversation even, but just generally within discussions around veganism in particular, there tends to be a focus on it being an individual decision. Do you go vegan or not? And judgment can come into that. And that's something that I think is almost a dead end, really, or a poor strategic choice, let's say, to make it all about individual conversion. I think our vegan stories depend so much on the context. And maybe that's something that I should reflect back on in terms of my own story, because I did very much narrate it as a personal story, but I was in different contexts. And that had a huge impact on my sense of my ability to be vegan, my knowledge about it, all of those things were very heavily contextual. And I certainly never want to present vegans as in any way kind of heroic or superior or some kind of more enlightened subspecies or something. That's not what it's about. What I'm interested in as a sociologist in particular is how do we create the social conditions within which veganism becomes normal, default, the way we raise our children, the way we organize society, so that it's just what people do. So in terms of the issues of artificial intelligence and so forth, I was really pleased when he brought up the Doctor Who chapter that I worked on with Kate, my partner, because a lot of what I suppose puts me off ideas such as transhumanism is from an uneducated perspective. I have to say, I'm in no way an expert in these things. I've only just kind of skirted around the edges of them. But what dissuades me from getting more involved and reading more is this sense that it sounds like more of the same kind of stuff that's got us into the problems we're in now in terms of human exceptionalism. And that's what really worries me. So the very word transhumanism, even, I find it a bit unsettling. So I'm not. I'd From the perspective I'm coming from, I don't feel invited into that world, and I don't feel curious to find out more. I feel more kind of alienated, if you follow me.
Well, parts of the reasoning why in the early 2000s transhumanism was kind of a little bit abandoned as a word, and the movement got renamed Humanity Plus. Right.
Yeah.
So that's part you're touching on some of those issues, but there are many
Right.
issues behind that. But that's part of why like rebranding happened, and from transhumanism it became more of a Humanity Plus. And now in the last few years, there's been kind of the backwards kind of movement. I think more people are kind of going back to that original word, transhumanism, and trying to. So the older strategy was change the word, to change the brand, to change what people kind of sort of how people emotionally react to it. But now people are coming up with a different strategy, which is like, oh, let's just change the meaning of the word transhumanism. So that would change the emotional response that people are predisposed to get to it. So there's like different strategies. But that's part of the reasoning why people rebranded it to Humanity Plus back in the day.
Oh, that sounds even worse to me. Humanity Plus sounds even worse, because it's humanity that's the problem. You know, the way humanity has constructed ourselves as superior is the problem. Which I'm keen
that
to
originates in the Enlightenment and humanism as a movement, even, right?
Of course, yeah.
So
and you come up against this very much in sociology as a discipline, as a discipline that's all about human beings. This is the way it constructed itself. So as sociologists working on, critical animal studies, or working on veganism, or having any kind of concern for other animals, is you're working uphill straight away. And I think that's why it's taken quite a long time for us to make progress, where now, thankfully, some of us are able to work on these ideas professionally. I mean, for many years, for me, this was just something I did in my spare time. It wasn't part of my paid job. And now finally it is, for which I'm very grateful. And that means there are many more opportunities that open up. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Since the Enlightenment, well, even before, in different ways, on different philosophical bases, but since the Enlightenment,
theological mainly, right?
Yeah, theological bases. Yeah, absolutely. But since the Enlightenment, the process, of course, intensified with the connection with industrialism and so forth, and all the impacts that's had on other animals. So I guess that's why I'm distrustful is not quite the word, but
suspicious.
Anything that seems to be centering the human, even if it's a different kind of human, I'm straight away thinking, oh, hang on, let's just step back a bit and think about others rather than ourselves. How can we, settle back down into patterns of relations with other creatures, with our planet, with our environment in the broadest possible sense, that are less toxic.
And in defense of transhumanism, there have been a lot of vegetarians at the sort of top level of transhumanism, or the founding sort of circles. And there's the idea of also of speciesism, which is a different form of racism, which vegans can very easily associate with. And so in transhumanism also, the idea is that, we shouldn't judge species based on their stratum, or whether they're biological or mechanical or silicon based, and we shouldn't judge them, because that's a form of racism. So there's also these emancipatory kind of movement, or parts of the movement, features that are also happening in defense of transhumanism. I should not.
Yeah, I don't want to upset or offend your listeners with my ignorance about transhumanism. So
No. As I said, it's a very complicated movement. It's a very big movement in the sense that not big in terms of size, but in terms of ideological kind of lineage. As I said, we have very strong Ayn Randian kind of wing, and there's a very strong sort of a socialist anarchist wing. So, and that tension has been there since the beginning. And that's kind of more also a divide between continental or European transhumanists and also North American transhumanists, if you will, in some
Yeah.
way. But anyway, Matthew, we've been talking for over 2 hours now. So where can people find more about you and your work if they're interested to do so?
Sure. Well, you can find my profile on the Open University website. If you just type in Matthew Cole, Open University on a search engine, you'll find a list of my publications there. One thing I'd like to mention, if you'll let me, is the a free course that's available on Open Learn, which is the Open University's free learning platform. And that's a course based on my work, like an introductory course to social scientific approaches to harms against non-human animals. I'm trying to remember the title of it. I really should have written this down in preparation.
Well, if you send me the link after the interview, I would link to it straight from our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So
as I say,
people
that's
can find that.
a free learning resource that anyone can access, and you'll learn more about my work through that as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, okay, so we come here to perhaps the most important part, the one single most valuable or most important takeaway that you want our listeners and viewers to take away from this conversation with you today. What would you like that to be? What do you want to send us with?
I think it would be something that I've come back to many times, which is how important humility is to veganism, and how important it is to think about veganism in terms of letting go of our presumed right to dominate others, our presumed right to exploit others. And I think that is really, really crucial as the counterweight to the anti-vegan discourse that surrounds us, especially when veganism is portrayed as elitism. You know, veganism in terms of its founding ideas is the opposite of elitism, the very opposite of it. And yes, there are problems in the vegan movement of, it being dominated by elites, perhaps professional elites, but that's not what the ideals of veganism are about. So that's really important, I think. And for me, being vegan is a process of letting go of that sense of my own importance as a human being over and above other species, and just kind of feeling more relaxed about my place as, a fellow earthling, if you like, a fellow life form amongst this huge diversity. Yeah.
Wow, I would say, that's also true, or it could be said, and it should be true also about transhumanism, by the way, because I think humility is crucial for transhumanism too, even though, there's also a lot of elitism associated with transhumanism, just as much as it's with veganism, and it's mostly, upper middle class white guys who are transhumanists. With some notable exceptions, of course. And also we have this kind of idea that I should have mentioned earlier about animal uplift, and whether we have, obligations or responsibility to provide more intellectual capacity to other species other than human species. Right, so there's that very strong movement, part of the transhumanist movement, which is the animal uplift movement, or idea anyway. So I totally agree with you that humility is something that can serve us in veganism and in transhumanism and in philosophy and in everything else we do every day of our life. So, I think that's a very useful advice. It's an advice that the Stoics have given us and could have given us, but they did give us, 2,500 years ago almost. So, I know that you try to live by that advice every day. I try to do so myself, and I hope our conversation makes other people consider bringing that into their own life a lot more predominantly. So Matthew Cole, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.